This morning I'm really excited to bring to you Dr. Coupland. He's a professor at Hillsdale College. I don't know if you're familiar with Hillsdale or not. It accepts no federal or state money whatsoever. So it is not subject to any federal regulations, rules, policies, or anything else. It does exactly what it wants to. It maintained a teacher education program up until a few years ago, and it was trying to produce a well-rounded, liberally educated teacher, and the Michigan requirements for teacher certificates got to be so overburdening and washed out all the significant content that they decided not to, I don't know, be certified or whatever for the state of Michigan. And they thought, well, this will be the end of our teaching program. But on the contrary, they maintain the rigor and quality of their education program, and their demand for teachers now, even though it doesn't qualify for a Michigan licensure, is greater than it's ever been. So that's a little background on Hillsdale. Dr. Coupland comes from Liberty University, and what was the other one? Michigan?
Yeah, Michigan State.
Michigan State. I'm a Southern boy. I don't get up in that climb very often, so those places are unfamiliar. But I know you'll enjoy his presentation this morning on Back to Grammar, the first liberal art. Dr. Coupland.
Well, I didn't trip on the way up here, so already my talk is going quite well, so I just wanted to let you know that. I want to thank you for having me here today. I believe in charter schools. I'm involved in helping charter schools open up around the country. I have served on a school board of a charter school, and so what you're doing is noble work, and I want to do whatever I can to help you in that regard. This is pretty amazing for me. To be here, primarily because you're here, you're educators. It's a Saturday morning at 8:30 on a Saturday morning, and you're here to hear about grammar. That's pretty amazing. I was a public school teacher for a number of years, and I can say that my Saturday morning was the one day of the week when I got to sleep in. So it's pretty amazing that you're here willing to talk or listen to what I have to say about grammar. I need to point out one thing to you quickly here. Oftentimes when I talk about English grammar, I have people respond in curious ways. They're a little bit afraid to come up to me and actually talk because they're afraid that I'm going to analyze their grammar in the middle of the conversation. In fact, last semester I got an email from one of my students who was in my grammar class, and she said, I have never rewritten an email 4 times until this email right here. I was carefully analyzing the structure. Well, just to let you know that I will probably make 1 or more grammar errors in this talk right here. In fact, the last time I gave a talk on grammar, I had a gentleman come up afterwards, and he was giddy. And he came up, and I thought he was going to ask this great question about the liberal arts and grammar and all of that. And he said, I caught a grammar error. I caught a grammar. And so he told me my grammar error. So I'll just let you know, I'm probably going to make a grammar error throughout my talk. And if you come up, don't overanalyze your grammar or anything like that. Hopefully we'll just be able to talk. Today we're going to talk about grammar, and we're going to look at it. We're going to look at language and the construction of language, but we're also going to look at grammar by paying close attention to history and also to art as well. So we're going to take a look at some art here to give us an understanding about grammar. Now, my title comes from a quote from a long poem written in 1259 AD. And it's this: sirs, the times are given to emptiness. Soon they will go entirely to naught. For 30 years this will continue. In other words, this lack of grammar. Until a new generation will rise who will go back to grammar. There are various points in the history of education where grammar has been ignored. But you can see that there were champions who stood up and said, no, 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 we're going to go back to grammar. Hopefully, we're on the cusp of something like that right now. Because if you've been paying attention to curriculum over the last a few decades, you know that certain things have been squeezed out of the curriculum. And one of those is grammar, especially English grammar. I'm going to talk in very practical terms today. Why should students learn grammar? When should they learn grammar? And then I'm going to be very specific in terms of how they should learn grammar as well. I do not sell any grammar products. I'm not advocating any kind of a curriculum or any kind of grammar program. I'm just going to give you the facts from what I have learned looking at the history of education and the history of grammar instruction. Now, before we talk about grammar specifically, I need to place it within a particular context. And I'm going to use these two terms right here, the servile arts and the liberal arts. Now, the servile arts are a narrowly focused kind of education that is narrowly focused towards a particular trade. Now, there's nothing wrong with the servile arts. After all, if I have a pipe break in my house and water's flowing throughout my entire house, I want a person who's been trained in the servile arts of plumbing. I don't want him to come over and say, let's think about this water flowing. What does this mean to our essence? I want him to know plumbing. When I go to have an operation, I want a doctor who knows how to operate. I want him to be specialized in that particular trade. But it's interesting, I also want that doctor to be able to think about the big questions as well. What does it mean to be a human being? What is life, right? It'd be great if the plumber could ask those kinds of questions as well. The liberal arts, in contrast, have been a broadly focused kind of education that is liberating to the students. And that's what you're offering in your schools, a broad education. That's why you teach math and reading and history and science, all of those things. Not to train your students in a particular line of work, which if you look at the history of education, oftentimes that was reserved for the upper classes. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to offer this opportunity to all students, a liberal education. Now, traditionally, the liberal arts were 7 in number, and they were divided up into 2 broad categories. One was the language arts. They were known as the trivium, and trivium is just trivium, 3-way road. There were 3 language arts. The other group was the quadrivium, or the quadvium, the 4-way road. And those are the mathematical arts, and I have them listed up here. So you can look back in history and you can see these 7 liberal arts represented in literature, in history, but also in art. And so we're going to take a look at some art where we have some representations of these 7 liberal arts. The first piece I'd like to look at is called the Garden of Delights. Now, some of you probably have seen this picture before. Perhaps in passing you don't know where it came from. The image that we're going to look at today comes from a lady. Her name was Herod of Landsberg. She was a nun, and she was responsible for the new students coming into the convent, that she was in charge of their education. So what she did was she compiled all the known knowledge of that day into a single book. And the students coming into the convent would have to learn from this book. Well, this is one page from this entire book. Now, you've probably already counted around the outside that there are 7 images around the outside here, and you can see them. At the 12 o'clock position, it's grammar, and then rhetoric, and then logic, and music, arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, and astronomy. And you can see the first 3 are the language arts, and the next 4 are the mathematical arts. All of the arts are represented holding some of their tools, the tools of their art. So you can see in geometry, geometry is actually holding a compass. You can see in music, music is holding a guitar and a harp. Well, I'm going to come in really close here to grammar. Grammar's in the 12 o'clock position. In one hand, she has a tablet in her hand, and she's kind of leaning forward towards the student, and her head is directed in the direction of the tablet. But also notice in her right hand what looks like a bent flashlight or something like that. This is actually a switch in her hand. Here's knowledge, here's the switch. Now we're going to get to that in just a moment. Here's another representation of the 7 liberal arts. And you can see they're written across the top. So arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, logic, rhetoric, and then to the far left here is grammar once again. Now notice all of the other arts. They're looking in a particular direction, either straight towards you or up in the air, depending on what they're trying to communicate. But look carefully at grammar. Her head is turned, once again, switch in hand. If you look very closely, she has switch in hand. But notice what is to her side here. There's an archway. In fact, I'm going to pull it in. It's not very clear, but you can see there's a little bit of an archway here. And grammar is turned with her arm towards what look like very small human beings. Those are students. And if you were to look at this very carefully, you would see that there's actually a stairway at their feet. They're coming into this hall of learning through this gateway. And isn't it interesting? The first person that they meet is grammar. They're not allowed to meet any of the others until they've met grammar, and she has presented what she has to give to them. This is a cathedral, a very well-known cathedral in France. Around the outside of the cathedral are images in the wall of a variety of things, the 12 apostles. But in this doorway right here, the 7 liberal arts are carved into this wall here. So I'm going to draw your attention to one place in particular. It's right here, and then I'm going to pull in very, very closely. So far we've seen grammar in the 12 o'clock position holding the book with the whip. Now I want you to see this image right here. I've pulled it in really tight here. This is grammar. It's a representation of grammar. Now you can learn a lot about education from this carving right here. Isn't it? Grammar standing up. She has her switch in hand. She has her book in the other hand. And there are 2 students at her feet. Now, on the left side, there's a student who's got his robe up all around him. He's got a book on his lap, and he's trying to read his book, right? But look at the person right next to that student. See what that student's doing, reaching across his body and grabbing the hair of the other student, right? So one student's trying to concentrate on his work very diligently. The other student not looking at the book. In fact, the book is actually fallen over because he's goofing around. Not only is he goofing around, he's trying to distract the other. Now, is this not true? If you're a classroom teacher, you have students in your classroom who are motivated to learn, and there's always one kid screwing around. Look at where grammar is looking, not looking at the motivated student. We used to call this in our school the 90-10 rule, right? You spend 10% of your time on you spend 90% of your time on 10% of the students. This kid's in the 10%, right, who's always distracted. Look where grammar kind of hovering over with the switch. Here are 3 other images of grammar. Notice 2 things across all 3 images: the switch in hand and young children. In fact, if you see the liberal arts represented in this architecture, it is only grammar that has young children with her. And in every case, you can see the switch and you can see children. Now, if you're getting tired of the switch, I am too. Grammar wasn't always represented with a switch. In fact, these are 4 images of grammar where she's not holding a switch. On the far right over there, you can see her holding a tablet, pointing to the tablet, but leaning over towards young students. Down at the bottom there is a beautiful image of grammar. The students are represented as plants. she has a pitcher of water in which she's leaning over, actually watering, cultivating these plants. Up above here in the red outfit, there are students holding up their language to grammar for her approval. And in her hand are the tools of the trade. But this last image is quite interesting. She's holding the book in her hand, but notice in the place of where there used to be a switch, she's now holding a key. Now I want to take that image and look at one more in particular. The liberal arts were often represented either as a cathedral or a mountain, in terms of you had to climb this mountain towards higher levels of learning. Now, in the lower corner here, you can see a student represented with his two hands open. In between him and the door of the cathedral is a lady, and that lady is grammar. Notice what she's holding in her two hands. In one hand, she has what's called a horn book, and if you were to look at this very carefully, you would see the alphabet on there, and she's leaning over, holding the horn book towards the student here with her head turned towards that student, inviting that student in. But in her other hand, you can see she's holding a key, and she's leaning towards a door, opening up the door to these higher levels of education. My last image. This is the seal of the University of Pennsylvania. From 1894, you can see these are the levels of knowledge moving up towards theology, which was always represented as the pinnacle of education in the Middle Ages. But you can see what's at the very bottom, grammatica, right? Grammar, it's the foundation, it's the widest that everything else is built upon. So what do we learn from these images here? Well, number one, sometimes learning grammar is not pleasant. In fact, grammar often has to use some extrinsic motivation to get kids to learn it, right? Now, I'm not advocating for a corporal punishment here in a grammar classroom, but just the idea of sometimes it's not so pleasant. But it is interesting that none of the other arts need a switch. Right? Once you have got students over that particular hump, they're much more motivated to learn these other arts. This image in the middle, the idea of grammar as foundation to everything else. And finally, grammar as the gateway to further learning. I'm going to be referring to a particular book throughout this talk. It's The War Against Grammar by David Mulroy. Just very quickly, he has this wonderful quote. From antiquity to the 20th century, grammar was introduced to children at the beginning of schooling. As soon as they learned how to read, it remained a central concern for several years. It was the foundation that was built carefully and gradually in the still receptive minds of relatively young pupils. Grammar as the foundation. I told you that there were particular times throughout the history of education where grammar lost its importance. This was another time, a person commenting on the loss of grammar. And he says this: less time and attention have been given to the study of grammar. As a result, we find men who profess all the arts, liberal and mechanical or servile, but who are ignorant in this very first one, this first foundational liberal art, without which it is futile to go on to attempt others. Why grammar? Why should we have students learn the grammar of their language? Good grammar, in its fullest sense of the term, is neither an embellishment nor an accessory to anything else. It is the law by which meaning is found and made. We're going to come back to that idea of finding meaning and making meaning. It may be, of course, that good education ought to provide something more. Let's hope that we move beyond grammar. That's not the only thing we give them. But it is preposterous, perhaps even wicked, to suggest that it can be had with anything less. Grammar as the foundation. My last quote. George Orwell in 1984 said this: for us as a culture, if we don't understand language, we are at the mercy of those who do. In 1984, don't you see that the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible because there will be no words in which to express it. You control language, you control thought, because thought occurs through language. And so any other kind of endeavor, critical thinking, we talk about critical thinking all the time, that occurs through language. If you don't understand language, you're not going to be able to think critically. So what happened to grammar instruction? If it was such an important part, what happened? Well, we're not going to have too much time to talk about this, but let me just point you in the direction of a couple of things. There's a wonderful article by a guy named Robert Shepard of the Core Knowledge Foundation. It's about 10 pages long or so. I would encourage you to read it. It'll give a good history of what happened to grammar. I've already referred to the War Against Grammar. It's about 100 pages long, and he takes the history of grammar instruction all the way back to antiquity and walks it through, even through American public education. I would like to point out one argument that he makes in the book that I think is central to what happened to English grammar. In American education, since about the 1900s, but really came about in the 40s, 50s, and especially in the 60s, is this idea of the child-centered approach. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I want my children to have teachers who care about them, who love them, who think about them when school is not going on. I want teachers who are loving and compassionate. And just like we heard last night, that love is not enough, right? There's content that needs to be taught. Kids need to learn things. And Mulroy points back to this idea of this child-centered approach, this noble child idea where, no, we can't infringe upon the student. We need to create space for the student. We don't want to impose ourselves upon the student. And what's more imposing than English grammar, right? He said what this led to was this contrast of a reflective judgment and a determinative judgment. In other words, what we have been trying to do in American education is to get kids to be reflective before they can actually determine what the text actually says. This is what he says. We increasingly encounter students who can speculate about the hidden meanings of literary texts, but miss their literal sense. Isn't that interesting? That we, in its crudest form, you would say, 2 + 2, how does that make you feel? Right? That kind of a thing. That's the mentality of it. We have students read text, and we have them reflect on a text, even though they don't even understand what the text says. That's a real problem. Mulroy points out that there are two main purposes for teaching kids grammar. One is kind of backwards looking, one's forward looking. He says one of the purposes is to preserve and revive an appreciation of literary classics. In other words, we should teach grammar so kids can read great works and that they can draw from those great works an understanding from the past to be able to understand what's going on right now. But if that's all grammar was, that wouldn't be worth it. Because the second purpose is to create future eloquence. If you understand how the language works, you can communicate to people in an effective way. That's what rhetoric is, the art of persuasion, being able to persuade people through ideas. If you understand how the language works, you're going to be able to do that. All right, let's get practical here for a moment. When should kids learn grammar? When should they understand how their language works? Well, I have this because people want specific parameters, and I'll explain this. But in general, this is where it should occur, in the middle grades. Remember the earlier quote that as soon as kids learn how to read, or are proficient in reading, we should transition into grammar. Now, that's not to say that kids in the 2nd grade cannot learn what a noun is. They should. And kids in the 3rd grade should know, perhaps, what an adjective is and what an adverb is. This can start very early on. But as kids become proficient in their ability to read, they should turn their attention to an understanding of the language. And if you know anything about language acquisition, you know that there's a thing called critical period, where kids need to acquire language before the onset of puberty. Well, guess what? These grades are perfect, a perfect opportunity to give kids a heavy dose of language and how the language actually works. 9th through 12th, hopefully, we'll be able to move on to some serious composition, work with students on being able to write and to write well. But without an understanding of how the language actually works, we're asking them to run before they can walk. So of course, grammar instruction will go on in the 9th through 12th grade, and it'll go on in the K through 3rd. But this era, or this period of their education, needs to be the primary time when they get a heavy dose of English grammar. They're ready for it. This is when they should be receiving it. All right, so how do we teach kids English grammar? Well, there are a variety of programs out there, and I'm not going to refer to any in particular. I'm just going to tell you that there at least are 4 ways of teaching kids how to understand English grammar. So the diagramming of sentences, which we're going to take a look at in a moment, and some of you are saying, oh, I remember that long time ago. I thought they went away with the dinosaurs or something like that. Expanding what are called kernel sentences, error correction, and then exposure to rich language. So let's take a look at all of these for a moment. Some of you remember doing stick diagrams, probably. Technically, these are referred to as Reed-Kellogg kinds of diagrams because they were named after the people who came up with the idea. Now, diagramming it was not handed down on stone tablets from above that this is the only way. Actually, these stick diagrams were developed over time after other things were tried and they failed. And just like those things, stick diagrams are not perfect. They break down. But they're a wonderful pedagogical tool. So I put this up here, and some of you roll your eyes immediately because you remember, oh my goodness, not again. Please make it stop. But this is what a stick diagram actually looks like, this kind of a structure, where you're taking a line of text and you're analyzing it and putting it into a diagram so that you can understand what these words are actually doing. Now, some of you have a skeptical eye and you say, oh yeah, this is really good for a certain kind of student. Yeah, it is. You know what student it's good for? The student who are not good in language. In fact, what's very interesting is I teach English grammar, and I have English majors who are very good at analyzing text, and they're able to see things and read in. And then I have a math major come into class, and he's, oh, not language. And then I teach him how to do this kind of diagramming, and he says, finally, I can take a piece of text, and I can analyze it, and I can figure it out. So this kind of diagramming is not necessarily for your advanced language students. In fact, it's probably for your students who struggle in language. It's a way of looking at language logically. So here we go. We're going to take some sentences here, and I'll just give you a little bit of a heads up. As I said, I teach an English grammar class at Hillsdale College, and the sentences I'm going to show you are on the final exam of my class. So hopefully it is being recorded, but I doubt my students will ever watch this. So this is on the final exam, so you're getting information. A few years ago, the American Book Review asked a group of scholars what were the best opening lines of novels. So they had this huge survey, they collected the results and compiled it. And they came up with the 100 greatest opening lines of books. So number 1, you could probably guess it. I won't have you call it out, but you could probably guess Moby Dick. Does anyone remember the opening line? Call me Ishmael, exactly correct. There it is. 3 words long, not too complicated, right? Well, when you go to diagram it, you realize it's in the command form, or the imperative if you're a grammarian. The author is telling you to do something. He's speaking directly to you, and it actually has even though it's written quite simply here, it actually has some complex things going on. We won't spend time on that. Number 2 is Pride and Prejudice. My wife would be thrilled. Pride and Prejudice. Do you know the opening line to Pride and Prejudice? Well, here it is, just in case you don't. It is this. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Now, those of you who teach writing in particular, you take a look at this sentence, and I want you to think back how many times when your students wrote over and over again, it is, there is, you said weak construction. It is a weak, it's not a very powerful construction. It's not a very powerful sentence structure. Well, just be grateful that your kids don't know about Jane Austen, because the second most well-known opening line of any novel, she uses this it is construction at the very beginning, which some English teachers would say is a weak construction. So you're criticizing Jane Austen here. Well, look at this. Here it is. Now, it's interesting because what looks like it is a weak construction. What she's actually doing here is she's changing the sentence around in order to draw your attention to a particular word. So originally, this sentence would have had all of this big structure here at the beginning, followed by is a truth at the end. What Jane Austen was doing here is she took this opening, what's a noun clause, moved it to the end of the sentence to get your attention to the fact that it is a truth. Number 1, she's drawing your attention to truth, but she's also playing a game here of saying, oh, you want to read along because you want to know what the truth really is. She was able to use language in this way to draw the reader's attention in. All right, this is a hotly debated issue right now. And here's what the amendment says. And I use the original language. It's the original comma use and everything. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The meaning of this clause right here, of this sentence here, is hotly debated even today. In government classes, in history classes, the meaning of this statement, students are engaging in that kind of analysis. Well, here it is. This construction of this sentence is a very, very rare construction. And I'm going to give you the term for it. It's called a nominative absolute. In other words, you have a noun out here called militia that's sitting out there on its own that is related to the independent clause there. Now, I use a lot of vocabulary there from grammar. But think about this. You're having a conversation about the Second Amendment of the Constitution. If your students understand what's going on grammatically, imagine how much more meaningful that conversation will actually be. All right. Number 2, expanding kernel sentences. Here's my sentence. Jack slept. Noun, verb. All right? One of the great practices that you can have students do is you can take something as basic as this, Jack slept, and have them expand upon it. So let's say you're teaching prepositional phrases. Jack slept until noon, having students add on this element. Jack slept until noon on the day of the big meeting. There's multiple prepositional phrases in a series there. After a late night, Jack slept until noon on the day of the big meeting. Notice how we're taking this kernel and allowing students to apply language elements to it and allowing them to expand. Now, you can go absolutely crazy with this. So, of course, I did. And I came up with this. After he had worked on his presentation into the wee hours of the morning, Jack slept until noon on the day of the big meeting, and he missed a wonderful opportunity to impress his boss, a man who had doubts about whether or not Jack could be trusted. This is a very complex structure going on, literally complex. A lot of grammatical elements, but notice that it was grown from this core element of Jack slept. Now, two things. When students are reading text, they should be able to take a long text like this and shrink it down to what is the author really saying? Well, the author is really saying that Jack slept. But in trying to also develop good writers, remember one of them was future eloquence? We can have students start with the very, very basic elements of language and expand on that and create some pretty rich texts. Error correcting. Now, we're not going to do this out loud, but the next sentence that I'm going to show you has two errors in it. So here we go. Take a look at it. It says, John should not feel badly about his inaugural speech because it only happened once. So in your mind, try to find the two errors here. All right, here we go. This is wonderful practice. Give students a line of text that looks grammatically correct and try to identify where the errors are. Here they are. Badly is an adverb. But yet it's very interesting. If you say, if you use this, I feel badly, or if you say, I feel bad, you'll have people come up and correct you. Say, I'm sorry. I don't mean to offend, but I think you mean badly. And you need to humbly, in your knowledge of grammar, just nod your head and keep on going. But technically, it should be the adjective bad, and only is out of place. Having students take texts like this and identify where the errors are and make those changes are important. Last but not least is exposure to rich language. There are some wonderful speeches and poems that kids should be memorizing. Memorizing was a major part of education for many, many, many years, many centuries. And we've lost that element of our schooling, where we take great texts, great speeches, great poems, and have students memorize them so it sinks deep down into their bones. So that when they hear things out of place, they know, hey, that doesn't sound right. Something's wrong there. Because they have those, what I like to call grooves in their mind. They have that rich language in their minds. And of course, reading aloud to students. You know, oftentimes we think of reading aloud to kids as maybe a kindergarten activity, maybe the first grade. I still like to be read aloud to. I know many of you do as well. Go into a high school classroom. They still like to be read aloud. Now, it doesn't mean you have to get the colored carpets out on the floor and everyone down. You don't have to do that in a high school classroom. But read aloud to your students. Let them see the joy of you reading, but in allowing them to hear you read, once again, those rich language patterns are coming into their minds and into their hearts. So what are the biggest challenges for implementing a strong grammar curriculum in your schools? Number one is finding teachers, or training teachers as well. David Mulroy says this: the problem started with teachers deciding not to teach grammar. Several decades later, many teachers could not teach grammar if they chose because they themselves have never had formal instruction in the subject. Now, I don't want you to feel too comfortable here, but it's not your fault if you're a teacher and you don't know grammar, because generations of teachers before you decided to jettison grammar. And as a result, it has been squeezed out of the curriculum. And so now many educators or future educators do not understand how the language works themselves. Nothing would do more to improve American students' knowledge of grammar than taking steps to ensure that K-12 teachers themselves understand the basic concepts. We took this personally at Hillsdale College in our teacher training program. We decided that we weren't going to let our teachers get through our program without a solid understanding of English grammar. Now, you need to understand, I teach at a college, and I teach some pretty talented students. And even those students come to Hillsdale College without an understanding of English grammar. I had a student in my class about 3 years ago. She was taking my English grammar class. She had just come off of an internship for a political candidate. that she had worked. And her job during the internship was she received all of the speeches beforehand, and she had to read them over for content, but also for grammar. And she was reading through these speeches, and she was making corrections. And she was telling me this in my office. She was telling me this because she was failing my grammar class. And she said, I know it doesn't sound right. In other words, she had a rich understanding of language. She said, but I can't understand why. In fact, my professors will write on my paper, I'm a dangling participle. And she said, I have no idea what a dangling participle is. I've never even heard of a participle before. She said, I can't even tell you what an adverb is. And so she was struggling. So I understand. We have very talented students at Hillsdale who can write well, who can read well, but yet they also lack an understanding of English grammar. So what we did was we said our first class that all our future teachers are going to take is English grammar, explicit English grammar. And we said you're not going to get beyond, or you're not going to be able to move along in the education program until you have a course in English grammar. Now, some of our students have had grammar and they progress very, very quickly through the course, but others struggle. And it's a good struggle, because they come out of that class knowing how the English language works. The other challenge, I would argue, is finding materials. Because grammar was squeezed out of the curriculum, publishers respond to the community. If you doubt me, look at how many publishers are referring to Common Core. Right? 10 years ago, you never saw that. But if a publisher does not know the Common Core standards and cannot connect them to the Common Core, they're dead in the water. They're not going to sell anything, right? So the publishers respond to the education community. And if grammar was squeezed out of the curriculum, well, you can imagine. Publishers ignored it for many years. And so we've had actually a few decades here where there are some grammar programs out there, some very good grammar programs out there, but they're hard to find. And what you see is a number of schools going back to older texts when grammar was a popular part of the curriculum, and going to those texts and using those texts because the current texts just do not meet the needs. I wanted to remind you of this quote from the very beginning. Sirs, the times are given to emptiness. Soon they will go entirely to naught. For 30 years this will continue until a new generation will rise who will go back to grammar. My hope is that we're on the cusp of something really big here, a return to grammar. And I'll just tell you right now, the local public schools are not going to do this on their own. In fact, I see your schools as the place where this can happen, where you can say, you know what? Our kids are not going to get through our school without understanding how the language works. There's a historical precedent for this, that you have to understand your language before you can move on to greater things. And I hope to see within the charter school community, with the schools that I work with, I primarily push this idea of a strong foundation in understanding how the language works. And hopefully you will be able to reach kids in your own schools, but maybe other schools will feel pressure that what's going on at these schools? Why are these students advancing so much? Part of it could be their understanding of the way the language works. And hopefully you'll be able to put pressure on other schools. Thank you very much.